Less than a week after the world's 20 biggest economies came together in London, 23 countries at the other end of the scale get their day. The European Commission's unveiled a €1 billion food facility to help poor countries weather the economic crisis. But is it any different from a long tradition of crippling loans which make the rich richer and the poor poorer? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamal Santamaria. There is, as we're all well aware right now, a global economic crisis going on. People in rich countries are losing their jobs, they're losing their homes, but people in poorer developing nations, the ones perhaps least responsible for this crisis, are losing their lives in some cases due to this economic downturn. So to rescue these people, just last week the G20 leaders pledged $300 billion over the next 2 years. And on Wednesday, the EU unveiled its own plan, with over $1 billion pledged specifically to ensure food gets to those who need it in those countries. Here's how the €1 billion breaks down. Remembering €1 billion these days, about $1.3 billion US. First, perhaps most importantly, these are not loans, these are grants. They will be invested directly in the countries. They won't need to be paid back. It starts with an initial release of €314 million to the 23 worst hit countries, but will eventually widen out to a full list of 50 developing nations, which will receive that total of €1 billion. Among the biggest recipients, Bangladesh, €50 million. The Democratic Republic of Congo, 40.6, and 39.7 million goes to the occupied Palestinian territories. Let's talk about all of this with our guests now. In Brussels is Stefano Manservisi. He is the Director General for Development at the European Commission. Also in Brussels, Alexander Pollock, the head of European policy and campaigns at ActionAid. And in London, rounding out our panel, is Jan Randolph. He is an economist and the head of sovereign risk at Global Insight. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. Stefano Manservisi in Brussels, let me come to you first. Seeing as this is European Commission territory, it is your baby if you like. €1 billion over 3 years to get agriculture back on its feet is what your press release said. Tell me what that means. What does getting agriculture back on its feet mean?
Well, it means first that this 1 billion is not in isolation, because you have certainly underlined the importance of the billion. But I would like to underline that this billion is part of the 49 billions that the European Union collectively has spent in 2009, in 2008. So I think that this is to be seen not only as one tool among others, but as part of the global effort that the European Union is doing in order to help developing countries in coping with crisis. We started with this 1 billion facility, say that in this way, in order precisely to create a bridge between the emergency, which appeared last year, in order to allow people to get out from the risk of dying for hunger, and the long-term development of agriculture. So this food facility is aiming at allowing farmers to purchase fertilizers, seeds, and to acquire capacity in order to enhance the agricultural productivity in this crucial period where crops should be particularly successful. So this is the very scope of this initiative. So it's very limited, is very targeted, is linked to the situation in the country and to the situation of world production of food.
With all that in mind, though, and I take your point that this is a very targeted project, it is specifically aimed at food, specifically for certain countries. But compared with other numbers that we've heard recently, €1 billion doesn't sound like an awful lot of money.
No, indeed, but that's the reason why I started recalling that this billion is part of the 49 and so, which have been spent by the European Union in 2008. I would like to situate this a bit, because, you know, in these days there have been the unveiling of figures of aid in the world, as the OECD DAC did, and as we ourselves also did. I would like to recall that figures for 2008 are putting the European Union as the biggest donor in the world, as it has been the case for the last year. 58% of the aid is spent by the European Union collectively. These amounts are more than €49 billion in 2008, which represent 0.40% of the European GNI. The 1 billion is part of this. this. So it's part of the strategy of keeping developing countries into, let's say, the objectives of our global recovery plan. It's not just a food facility in itself. 1 billion is not enough, of course, but 49 billion are more than less, I would say. Let's
get the view of Alexander Pollock, also in Brussels. You're from ActionAid. What do you make when you see these numbers? And bearing in mind what Stefano has just told us, what do you make of it all?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. We clearly made the point that when you looked at the food crisis is not new. When we ourselves launched a campaign, for example, about the food crisis 2 years back, people were kind of laughing, saying it's not the emergency, it's not the priority. Hence, our colleagues in the South say there is a food crisis looming, so we need to act about it. So we put pressure on governments, and we're happy that this 1 billion, was released somehow by the EC and EU collectively. But as you said, when you looked at the overall picture, first, it's nothing new. The announcement had already been made, so that's what is quite worrying. And secondly, if you look at what the Food and Agricultural Organization had said already back in November, they say that if you really want to address the grassroots causes and the really deep roots of hunger, it's something of the order of $30 billion a year, that would be needed to really address the root causes. And no, it's not only a problem of the quantity of aid, but there is a worry of civil society organization in the south and in the north that the quality of this aid as well is dangerous, because it's not only providing seeds, fertilizer for big agro-businesses, but it's making sure that this money is actually going to benefit smallholder farmers, very modern farming organization as well. And we know that in terms of aid to agriculture, if you look at only the European Commission, the part of the all EC aid, European Commission aid that is going to agriculture, dropped from something around 20% in the 80s to something close to 4 and 6% today. The same from African countries. So people gave up agriculture. Hence, we know that with this crisis, the number of hungry people is not going beyond the 1 billion, which is very worrying. Every 5 seconds you've got a child dying. So this initiative is interesting politically, but it's worrying.
Let's get a really quick response from Stefano Manservisi before I go to Jan Randolph, just to answer some of those claims. Alexander Pollock saying 30 billion a year needed.
No, I think that first I agree on the fact that the situation in agriculture is worrying. I agree on the fact that this is not, let's say, the only measure that we have to take, and I agree, of course, on the fact that the centrality of our and other support to agriculture has decreased over years. I think that all this is true, and we have precisely to reverse all this. How? First, in putting back agriculture at the center of our development policy, we are launching all the midterm review of our programming, and we gave the possibility, we are going to give the possibility to all our partners to refocus more on agriculture. Second, the food facility is not, or the projects which have been identified in the food facility in this billion are not for the big business. I mean, we are working with a lot of small farmers organizations through our partner agency, which could be the World Bank, the UNDP, FAO. For example, I mean, I've recently been in Cuba, which is also beneficiary of this facility, of this billion, and this is clearly only for small farmer association, as it is in Zimbabwe, for example, as it is in many West African countries. So it is not for big business. I mean, it depends on what in each situation is the best way to allocate this money and to spend this money in order to generate a positive circle of production. Last, I think that agriculture is not just invest in supplying seeds in fertilizer. Is also to start looking at the situation of exploitation of land ownership, of the connection between land and big cities. So I think it's something which is much more complex, and I believe that, for example, part of our budget support should also be addressed in order to be able to cope with all the different aspects of this story.
And we're going to talk more about...
I agree on the fact that is not enough. It's not enough. We have to do more, but I mean, collectively.
Right, we're going to talk more. You mentioned exploitation. We're going to talk more about that in the second half of the programme. Let's bring in Jan Randolph, who's been waiting over in London, where, of course, the G20 met last week and threw $1 trillion, I think it was, at the IMF, $300 billion specifically to go towards developing countries. Is what we're seeing from the European Commission perhaps a better way of doing it, as they're saying, front-loading the real problem countries, if you like, taking it directly to those countries rather than just giving them money and say, that's for your developing countries, do with that as you see fit?
I mean, I do like, on the one hand, I think these projects are great. I mean, they're well-intentioned, well-designed, targeted, dealing with the poorest of the poor, the rural poor, in areas where there's greatest need, i.e. food security. All that is well and good. Grants, it doesn't burden the country with heavier debts, and it's an alternative to the usual trickle-down economic development theories where you stimulate the entire economy. It seems much more measurable, much more focused, and it's bound to give immediate returns. That's the the one part of it, but the wider context. Africa has been growing at 5-6% over the last few years. It's in a bit of a time lag, but now it's beginning to be hit quite hard. The collapse in commodity prices, the collapse in demand. This is what's driven growth over the last few years. That is now going into reverse. And the sorts of numbers we're talking about are much greater than the numbers that these projects can deal to handle. Having said that, it is all this is welcome in addition to the tripling of the IMF resources, because countries, not just in Africa but in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, are facing very severe financial crises. There's capital flight, there's loan redemptions, as investors pull out, putting huge downward pressure on foreign exchange reserves, and they need to turn to organisations like the IMF for bridging loans, liquidity support in the short term. Trade finance is so crucial, and that's collapsing along with trade itself, but also the deleveraging of banks. And all that is putting intense pressure on countries in Africa.
And
so,
intense pressure, if I can interrupt you, sorry, as well, pressure as well on these European countries. We're specifically looking at the European Commission because this is their plan. But to go asking countries for extra money for the developing world at the moment, I wonder, is that a tough sell at the moment?
It is a tough sell, but there are commitments, and we all live in the same boat at the end of the day, and a dollar invested in a dollar invested in Africa is going to have a bigger impact in terms of consumption to support growth than elsewhere in the higher income countries, for example. But all these measures need to be taken together. We are in the same boat, but there is an overwhelming downward pressure from the collapse in trade. Half the investment projects in Africa have been put on shelf on our estimates, and these will have a negative impact. So projects like this come in from the other side. I mean, they're well-intentioned, they're well-designed, but they have very limited impact. We need to ramp up the commitments here, I think.
Alexander Pollock, just before we go to a break, quick word from you there in Brussels. There is criticism, I guess, of a plan like this and previous plans of there not being enough freedom for countries who are receiving the money to spend the money as they see fit. They see fit. It's their country. How do they want to spend it? Isn't that actually, in fact, where it can all go wrong? Isn't this what the European Commission is doing by giving money specifically to specific groups and saying, use this properly?
Yeah. I think it's really the key question, and you've seen the reaction of various countries, and most of our colleagues from the South reaction from G20 was kind of mixed, really welcoming these big efforts that are being put on the table in terms of really big extra money that is going to IMF and to a lesser extent to the World Bank. But then the big worry in that, how are we going to ensure that the mistakes of the past that IMF, World Bank, and EC indirectly, because supporting a lot IMF and World Bank, made by sometimes imposing conditionality on countries, which had as an effect, we're talking a lot with our African colleagues and Asian colleagues, and many didn't forget that sometimes the conditionality was that you have to cut your public budget, and the only choice they had is to cut the budget of health, to cut the budget of education, to cut the budget on agriculture. So how are you going to make that the new money that is making available on the table is actually going to reach country and is actually to leave the policy space, for country to put together strong health policies, to put together strong education policies, and to put together strong agricultural policies. And it's very key that they have to be monitored. Everyone has to be monitored. So that's why it's so important that the IMF so far doesn't have the legitimacy to do it. So to bring really poor countries at the table, they were present, but so far they don't have the same voting rights than rich countries. So we can understand the skepticism. And as well, the civil society in the South, you know, it needs to be strengthened, and that's what we're trying to do.
All right,
to make sure they monitor where the government is spending the money, and to make sure it doesn't cut in human capital investment, which is key for economic growth.
All right, gentlemen, stick around after the break. We'll widen our discussion out, see what more could be done. Why not? Aid money and packages are crucial, but what about truly investing in a developing country? We're back in a moment.